Welcome everyone to the longest titled session at the conference, So Many Files, Structuring the Lifecycle of User Files in a Museum Network Environment on-prem and cloud. Before we get started, we just wanted to sort of set some expectations of kind of what this session is all about. Hopefully you know you registered for a deep dive session, which is actually a new format here at MCN. And so give us a little leeway as we kind of fumble through this process because we don't have any sort of benchmark to compare it to. But what we wanted to make sure was clear was this is a very much roll up your sleeve session. Yes, there's a panel. We're actually not going to talk a ton. This is a very interactive session with everyone. We're going to eventually end up in some breakout groups and really trying to have some conversation and collaboration amongst everyone in the room to help think through this challenge. So if that's not what you're up for, no, we won't. We won't take it personally if you decide to move on. But we just want to make sure that everyone understood that we've all talked a little bit about this. We're all at different phases in this challenge, but we definitely don't have all the answers, and that's really what this deep dive session is all about. So with that, let me talk a little bit of how we got here, and then we'll move into some introductions. So this conversation actually started within the MCN IT SIG. And so if you're not familiar with the special interest groups that exist here within MCN, there's, I think, 11 of them. They cover subjects like IIIF, strategy, social media, IT. And so if you're not a member, consider becoming a member. The website has a lot of details. Janice is actually the chair of the IT SIG, so you can come see Janice afterwards, and she'll make sure to get you signed up with this SIG. You may also want to consider it because we're hoping to take all this information and share it. The SIGs use Basecamp as a way to kind of have conversation throughout the year, as well as share resources. And so we're going to hopefully take what comes from today's session and share it there. Anyway, within the last 12 months or so, there was some conversations within the IT SIG about file management, and I think the question initially started as who's still running on-premise and who's migrated completely to the cloud, and how did you do it, and what did that look like, and did you use Microsoft OneDrive, and all those kinds of questions. And so the four of us, I think, were maybe, I don't know, we maybe said more than others, and so at some point one of us said, good MCN community member, we should propose a session where we just brainstorm this because none of us have the answers. And so unbeknownst to us, MCN was working on this deep dive conversation or deep dive session format, and so here we are. So a little bit of how this is going to work. We're going to quickly run through introductions of who we are. We're going to utilize Slido. If you were in the last session, you maybe have already used it once, and we'll explain exactly how to do that in a second. But we're going to take a poll to try to get a sense of what the room is interested in talking about. And then we're going to break off into some breakout sessions and really kind of talk through these topics. What we're hoping is going to happen is somebody within each of the groups will volunteer to take some notes. Ideally, if you can be taking those notes on some sort of digital device, so you could email it to us afterwards, that would be awesome. And then we're hoping either that person or someone else can, at the end, maybe be a spokesperson for the group and kind of share back the conversation. And then we're really hoping at that point to open the dialogue with everyone. So we're hoping everybody has a chance to, hear about each of the topics, share some thoughts, et cetera. And really the goals here are that everyone can leave the room today, wherever you are in this sort of life cycle, with some things you can take home and hopefully act upon, and maybe even pie in the sky, maybe we can start defining some best practices for our sector around this, and then ultimately again try to drive this conversation for the next 11 and a half months or whatever it is until we all see each other in Baltimore. So with that, I think we're going to move to introductions, and I think Janice is first on the slide deck.
Hello everybody. I'm Janice Craddock. I'm head of IT at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Like Brian said, when we first started talking about this topic, I was at one of those what do I do now moments. I had been tasked with moving our network files to the cloud, and what did that mean, and implementing a robust intranet. As more of our staff were moving to working remotely, we needed a better solution for accessing files and collaborating on documents. We needed to centralize our online services and file storage and provide better backup and business continuity for the files that lived in the cloud. The challenges I faced were establishing a collaborative space for document development, co-authoring documents in real time and tracking and approving being the main needs of the staff. We were looking for centralized online file storage, Google, Dropbox, Box, you name it, my staff was using it. And when they left, the files just kind of disappeared with them. And we also had limitation of software. We were using Office 365 E1 with on-prem applications, and it didn't have some of the functionality that we needed. So we started a process. Our first step was to develop a committee of 3. I really say small committees to determine the scope of our project. And we wanted to involve the staff in discovery and buy-in. So we did a survey, and 75% of our staff responded to our survey, which showed a huge interest in a change. 70% of the staff were working away from the office, and so we saw a really big need. And 62% were interested in some kind of project management tools to streamline our digital workflows. So we started with small group meetings to identify needs and levels of comfort in file sharing. We had a staff that wanted to give complete access to all of our files to everybody. And then we had people on the other end that didn't want to, well, we're not so open, let's say, about sharing. Most were open to sharing final documents, but the main concern was confidentiality and miscommunication that would be derived from drafts or too many versions of the same document before they were finalized. So after that, we did a lot of beta testing. Like I said, a lot of our staff were using different online tools, so we tested each platform to determine the pros and cons and how they worked within our organization. Once we settled on Microsoft, we started small. We addressed staff with the most pressing needs. And currently, our current situation is we are progressing to engaging more staff using OneDrive. It's been a very slow process. We are upgrading to Office 365 E3, and I'm learning how to use SharePoint Teams. So that's where I am.
Thank you, Janice. Hi, everyone. I'm like behind this podium here. My name's Rebecca Menendez. I'm the Director of Information Services and Technology at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. And I kind of had a different approach into this problem. I was at the beginning of the year sort of browsing around looking at our user file environment. I was working on moving our offsite backups from tape to cloud, and the user files are actually about 75% of the data on the network. So I was trying to figure out what to do with this large amount of data and if I could find a cheaper solution for backups. So what I found on the file servers was, as expected, a lot of inactive files, abandoned files, but I also found files that were in structures that the users had created related to their past work, so they seemed organized, and I thought, oh, I could just move some of these organized structures to a archive server with read-only access, and then I could produce, I could set up a less expensive style of backups for those. So another thing I noticed while browsing through the files is that there was a lot of, it was clear that there was a lot of problems that users were having with sharing across departments, because I had set up many years ago a structure of file sharing on our servers that was related to the departmental structure of the organization. And as users started working cross-departmentally, or they were having trouble finding ways of organizing those files on the network. And so there was a lot of areas that were confusing and difficult to navigate. And so I thought, well, I could fix that. I could just create a part of the network that's related to cross-departmental working groups and set up security groups related to those working groups. So I went out to talk to the users and get their buy-in with my ideas. And of course, talking to users made everything that much more complex. They were okay with my ideas. They didn't love them, but they didn't want to talk about them. What they wanted to talk about was they had been trying to solve the problems on their own of working cross-departmentally and across institutions, and they had been trying out all kinds of tools that they found on the internet. So Google Docs and Dropbox and Basecamp. And I did kind of know they were doing that. But what I didn't know is they were dissatisfied with the results. So they found the decentralized nature of all these different tools to be confusing and unorganized, and they couldn't agree on which tool to use for what, and so there was like a lot of the same document out there and that kind of thing. So they sort of tasked me with finding them a flexible environment that had the flexibility but more structure and sort of unified tools so that they could know what each other was doing within their working groups. So all of a sudden my project changed from trying to just work on offsite backups to completely reworking the tools that the Autry staff uses for collaboration and file sharing and developing new workflows. So that's where we are today. We made a really quick decision this summer to go ahead and use Office 365 and SharePoint, and that was because we already had it because we were using Office 365 email. And it was familiar to the users. And also, if you haven't checked the collaboration tools lately that Microsoft is building, they're better than they were a couple of years ago. So it seemed like we could make use of them. So we've had our key users trained, and we have started up building our first couple SharePoint site sets. And we're just trying to figure out how that works. And I have built the archive server and set up the backups for it. And I'm just still working on moving a whole lot of files over to it. And next we're going to start thinking about governance. And also we're going to try to figure out how to do digital records management. And so hopefully we'll get some great ideas today that I can take back and make use of at the Autry. So I'm going to pass on to Brian.
So I'm Brian Thornburg. I'm the Director of Technology at the Denver Art Museum. I've been there about 5 years, or a little over 5 years now, and if you were in the plenary panel, I'm going to apologize because some of this is a repeat because it's a similar topic, but I've spent most of that time centralizing data throughout the organization. It was very decentralized. It was scattered across, USB hard drives to NAS devices to, local storage on a server, and, went through the, I guess, typical efforts of, figuring out where that all was and then how much space do we need. Ultimately landed on a SAN and have moved all that data to that infrastructure, which has now allowed us to, focus on backups and DR and things like that. During that time, we also adopted Office 365. I think we actually adopted it pretty early in my tenure at the Denver Art Museum, and so it has matured a lot since we've been using it, and so we're having a lot of conversations about what role does it have, both as a collaboration tool, but also a storage solution for us. So my biggest challenges are looking at sort of standardizing around some sort of cloud storage solution. I'm assuming I'm not the only one that we have a lot of Dropbox, we have a lot of Box, we have a lot of Google Drive, we have a lot of OneDrive. It feels like OneDrive is our solution because of the nature of the fact that it's free since we're a nonprofit museum. But I'm very open to that conversation with my staff and trying to understand the needs. And then also, what's the right collaboration tool for us? Like I said, everybody's used to the Google Docs and the shared docs and how well that works. And I think if you were an early adopter of Office 365, you didn't see that maturity and functionality within Word and Excel and things like that. I think it's come a long ways in the 5 years that we've been using it, but is that the right solution for us? Also then it's the next phase of the life cycle of what do we do about archiving data and having, this is the first museum I've worked at. I often joke that, you know, we're a museum, we keep everything by nature, and so we keep every file by nature. But we have developed some policies around individual files, sort of the personal drive concept, and as part of our termination process for staff, the form that managers fill out to notify the respective departments like security and IT and whatnot that someone's leaving, we do ask a question about personal data and what do you want to do? And we have a default how long we retain it for. We do have some options with a business case on retaining something longer, and it's typically curator's been here for 30 years. There's probably some provenance, there's probably some donor relationship data that's in there that we want to maintain and not just delete. And so we've got a process defined, but it could be better. We have a ton of, I believe, orphaned files and this massive share that everyone uses just to share between departments that needs some attention, and that's something that we're definitely struggling with. Security is always something I'm thinking about just by the nature of my role. What role does encrypted storage have in our environment? How do we best manage rights and access to the data? How do we ensure that we're auditing those rights and access? PCI and PII data, if you were just in the last session, you heard a little bit about that. And then finally, sustainability is a big challenge. I'm always trying to think 3 to 4 years ahead of kind of where we are today and what does that look like? And I asked some of the, you know, maybe not so popular questions of, if Microsoft tomorrow started charging museums for Office 365, what does that look like for us? Do we keep our data there? Do we keep it as an email solution? Can we afford it? Those kinds of things. And so, you know, that's certainly some challenging conversations, and I think especially when you're just trying to get organized and get things moving, but I want to make sure that we're sort of thoroughly thinking through the reasons that we're doing these things before we do them. Just so that we are, you know, as best prepared as we can be. And certainly some of those are crystal ball questions that maybe we're not going to know the answers to, but at least hopefully we've thought about it a little bit from a, you know, if we had to migrate, what might that look like? So those are my challenges.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I hate microphones. Are you okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Abby Kramer. I'm the Digital Asset Manager and Digital Archivist in the Department of Digital Infrastructure and Emerging Technology at the Harvard Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I think I bring a slightly different perspective to this conversation than the rest of my co-presenters. I work in IT now, but my background is actually in archives. So I maybe have a different sort of approach to records management and have a different perspective as a result of that. And another reason that I think I bring a different perspective is that at the Harvard Art Museums, we actually feel pretty good about where we are with our user files. We feel that way for a couple of reasons. The first is that between April 2018 and April 2019, we migrated from our old network shares to SharePoint Online. The network shares were about 14 years old, so they were really messy, lots of orphan files. It was terrifying. We did a lot of cleanup before the migration. We effectively told the powers that be that we only wanted to migrate active files, no orphan files, no trash. So we worked really closely with the archivist and records manager at the museums to facilitate that. She and I met with almost the entire staff to educate them about file management best practices and to really work with them on that cleanup. Very hands-on, the two of us were really in the weeds with them working on that. And it was a really remarkable opportunity, I think, that we were able to really focus resources from throughout the museums on this file management project, right? Like nobody ever puts that as a priority. So that was pretty cool, pretty unusual and really valuable for us. So that has put us in a really good position right now, at this very moment. Our main storage location, SharePoint, is really clean and tidy, and file management is really fresh in people's minds. So that's one reason that we feel pretty good. The other reason is actually the very unique design of my job. As I said, I sit in IT. I don't know if I said that. Did I say that? I sit in IT, but I am half IT and half archives. So my IT half, among many other things, manages storage and maintenance of our active user files. I also advise on workflows involving file management, which is pretty much every workflow, just if you think about it. My boss is amazing at getting me into those conversations. So anytime a new project is starting and we're thinking about how we're going to store data, usually in the form of a file of some kind, I'm in that conversation talking about how we're going to manage that and how that data is going to get stored and then what's going to happen to it long term. So that puts me right in the middle of the active stages of the file lifecycle. So things like creation, maintenance, use, and sharing. The archives half of me manages preservation storage and, well, of inactive files, both temporary and permanent. And I also develop and execute preservation and access policies and procedures. So that puts me right in the middle of the inactive stages of the lifecycle: preservation, access, reuse, destruction. So at the Harvard Art Museums, we have one person, me, who's looking at the entire file lifecycle from start to finish and back around again, right? Which I think is really unusual. I don't know of anywhere else that has something set up that way. So I think it gives us a huge advantage. It means that when I'm looking at any individual stage in that life cycle, I can be planning for all the others, or at least considering all of the others. And it also means that we have a lot more control over sort of how all of those things work together, and we can kind of anticipate issues coming at us from down the road, and maybe, if we're lucky, resolve them, or at least try to anticipate how we might resolve them before they become a fire that we have to put out. So we're doing a lot less slapping a Band-Aid on something and a lot more programmatic solutions to potential issues. So it's amazing, it's great. And I say all of this not to toot my own horn, but to toot the horn of my boss who developed the job. It's a really great setup. But that is not to say that we don't have any challenges. That's why I'm here. We do have challenges. The challenges that I'm really looking at are the challenges that we're facing from this point forward, having completed the migration. Those are things like, how soon is too soon to start migrating off additional services, right? We have SharePoint. We want to make that the service that we're using. We want to get rid of Dropbox and OneDrive and all these other things. Well, we can't really get rid of OneDrive because we have SharePoint, but we want to reduce our use of it. So how soon is too soon for us to start doing that? And how late is too late for us to kind of capitalize on the project we've just done and do it again, basically? How do we effectively resolve the perpetual confusion among our staff between OneDrive and SharePoint and now Teams, right? What are these things? We don't know. I don't even really know, so who knows? How do we help our staff maintain good file management practices and kind of keep that momentum from this project, right? It's all fresh in their minds right now, but it's not going to be, tomorrow or now. So those are the things that are really on my mind right this minute. But we certainly faced a lot of challenges during the migration, which I suspect might be more of interest to talk about in this session. Some of those were things like getting institutional buy-in for the migration project, getting that to be a priority for the institution. That was a big one. Getting our colleagues to see the value of file management, right? Nobody cares about that. I am the only person on the planet who gets excited about that. I'm fine with it, but we had to get other people to at least understand the value of it, even if they weren't excited. We also had a lot of resistance from people about learning a new system, right? Everyone is too busy to learn a new system. So we had to deal with that. We also had trouble, maybe other people faced this, we had trouble getting various departments to stick to the deadlines we had set. And we also had some kind of surprising trouble, I thought, with people really having a lack of trust in SharePoint or Microsoft in general because of bad experiences with old versions of SharePoint from, like, who knows, the 90s. So we had to kind of get over that, which was an interesting challenge that I really had not anticipated. And lastly, I'm also really happy to talk about records management and digital preservation as they relate to all of these other issues. And I will end by embarrassing myself by telling you that I'm really excited to talk about all of these things with you. So without further ado, I will hand things back to, I think, Janice to introduce Slido.
Okay, as Brian said earlier, this deep dive session is group participation. So we will be breaking out into groups as a result of this survey, and we will discuss the challenges that we've discussed the challenges that we face. Now we'd like to hear from you. So pull out those devices, go to slido.com, and the code is files. You can enter as many as you feel that you have that you are challenging with.
And maybe a low-tech solution, if you don't feel like your challenge has been captured up there, maybe, this is super informal, shout it out, let's talk about it, see if there's other interest. Again, the goal here is to, all of us to be able to feel like we have gotten something from this session, and so we want to make sure we're taking everybody's thoughts and interests and why they're in this room today into account as best we can. As well as if you feel like any of these need definitions, please, well, we thought they were straightforward, but you know how that goes.
I'm interpreting change management as like staff changes, or is that just like any kind of?
I think it's just the general concept of change management. So the apprehension for change, the how do you successfully manage it throughout the organization, how do you old habits die hard, and how do you, deal with that, all of that.
Wow. Got a lot of interesting results up there. We were going to break out in 3 groups, but we kind of have maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 kind of have at least like 50% interest in there. How many people do we have?
Like 32,
33, so it looks
like everybody's voted, yeah. So
Yeah.
we could do. Does everyone feel like your top 1 or 2 is maybe captured in those top, say, 4 or 5?
Or, yeah.
I just don't want to discount the folks who are just trying to figure out
Where to start.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, yeah. Maybe, why don't we do this by show of hands? Maybe we'll go through these and kind of see. To your point, I want to make sure that we kind of have, it's not 2 people that end up being in a session or a breakout by themselves.
Want to mention with change management, I know it's very high on everybody's list. Was it high on everybody's list because of the culture of museums, and would we end up diving into a culture discussion as opposed to change management with file? Just to mention that, like, are we gonna get too far off the rails to talk about change management when that's a institutional thing as opposed to
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that may be.
Where do I start people, if you put all of where do I start people? in the
Yeah,
first one,
fair enough.
Right. So maybe we should just talk, maybe break out in like 4 groups. And kinda-
Yeah,
and
based
then
on-
and
based
then
on
we
the
can kind of
subjects.
talk about the other ones as
Okay.
a whole.
Okay, so we're gonna start with just the top 4, and feel free to
Maybe 5, because
do 5.
I was gonna say, if you really think about all of these, change management
Is a piece of all of it?
So maybe just make sure that the change management conversation is in each group.
That's a great suggestion. Is everybody comfortable with that? If we okay.
Top one and start below that.
Great. Okay, so we're going to take too many files, record management, institutional archives, collaboration tools, and file sharing and governance policies. I guess our thought was we would have you physically move into these groups and kind of maybe in the corners. Again, we're looking for somebody to help take some notes. The 4 of us are really thinking we're just going to float around because we're here because you're here as well. So we don't have all these answers, but we'll certainly try to provide, some direction as best we can. But again, we're hoping somebody in the group will take some notes, and then either that person or somebody else will also kind of be the voice of the group later. We have, oh, go ahead.
So I was just gonna say, we want you to like brainstorm in these groups and share your experiences, maybe start by introducing yourself and tell them where you are in this process. And then our aim is to, explore the topics in this space and welcome and amplify the multiple of different perspectives that we each have. And it's not actually to identify, we may not identify potential solutions today, but we can talk about kind of where we are and where we go from here. And maybe even have to follow up in base camp later on.
And I think as you saw, we do have a lot of time dedicated to this session. And so we are not going to force this session to go to 12:30 if it doesn't need to go to 12:30, but we also have a lot of time. And so we thought we would start with maybe a half hour in these breakouts, kind of see where we are, and then maybe we could switch it up if we feel like people want to continue the conversation. This honestly is supposed to be a collaborative effort with everyone in the room, even though we're the four sitting up here right now. So,
What we do is show of hands
Yeah.
to see who wants to talk about each session, and then if we have too many in one session, we may have to kind of break you up. How does that sound?
so too many files, how many, just show of hands if you would choice
Okay,
into that group.
That's a
Okay.
good group. Look at each other.
Why don't we do too many files up here in this corner, kind of near the screen? Records management and institutional archives. All right. Maybe we'll have you go in that corner back there. Collaboration tools and file sharing. Why don't we have that group go over here by the, I guess the water's back in that corner. And then governance and policies. 3. Okay. Why doesn't that group meet up here? And maybe a couple of us will join that group to maybe try to even that number out. So, any questions? Awesome.
And you can move the chairs around. We'll straighten them out
yeah.
afterwards.
No, that's kind of excellent.
Okay, guys, Okay, guys. Was that a fun exercise? It seemed like there was a lot of conversation going on, at least. That's good. So who wants to be the first group to talk?
Should we start at the top? Too many files?
Sure, go for it.
Too many files. Anybody from that group? I'm happy to, but.
Please, we didn't really take time.
So I just wrote down, I mean, almost in hindsight, I feel like too many files could have probably just been change management as well and just like sprinkled it into every conversation, because I don't know that we definitely did not come to a solution, that's for sure. I mean, somebody in the group said, you know, that it's good to hear that, you know, everybody's dealing with the same problem, which I think is kind of what we came across. Some of the themes I jotted down were just, you know, a lot of what we got into was what role does governance and policy play in that, which is ironic because we weren't in that conversation, but and who's setting the governance and policy, I think it was a big theme in our conversation. Primarily just, you know, there's some members of the group who, you know, don't have any authority in their organization, and so they're like, how am I setting that you know, that governance or that policy without, you know, managing without any authority. The role of educating staff was certainly another theme throughout, you know, that, you know, no matter how many systems and tools and policies we have in place, you know, there's still the human factor that we need to take into account, and what does that piece have. Shadow IT was certainly another topic, you know, talking about some of these collaboration tools, and, you know, it is great that these are free solutions, but certainly, you know, it's the free kitten scenario, right? So, resource constraints, we talked a little bit about just as we're adopting all of these new tools and solutions, there is a staffing implication for that as well, and our institutions are certainly not, you know, probably prepared for that. And so, you know, when you implement a digital asset management system, you know, doing that without a digital asset manager is you know, not great. And so, you know, how do we try to address that? We got a little bit into a conversation about the role of a digital asset management system in too many files, and what goes there versus, you know, what doesn't. And, you know, I think there were a couple examples of some institutions that have thought through that, and, you know, it's just final versions go into the digital asset management system. But again, how do you, the story was shared that, like, you know, the graphic designers are not great at getting the final version to the digital asset manager to put it into the system, but then how does she force that, because that's not her department, the manager of the department, you know. We talked a lot about trying to use, you know, whether it's the security side of things, the legal side of things, to try to force some of these conversations, and success we've had there. I shared that, like, sometimes I tie things back to donors, and that always seems to work, or artwork always seems to, you know, how can you find these sort of hot button topics that might help make some headway with some of these issues. And then ownership was also just another big theme, and who owns what? Is it IT owning this? Is it you know, the individual business units that are owning this? Is it, you know, some individual within those units? And I think some of that probably got back to governance and policy, so we went full circle. So others that were part of that conversation, anything I skipped or other themes or topics that we didn't talk about?
It seemed like too many files is a result of the lack of everything else.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Don't start.
Yeah, yeah. Start over from scratch, yeah, yeah. Anybody else in that group? Anybody that wasn't part of that group, anything that resonated, anything you want to talk about, or do you want to move on?
One thing we kind of identified in our group that can play along with that is both Google Drive and OneDrive, SharePoint have really good document search tools.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you do start with too many, getting them up there can help you find what you want a little bit easier than if it's on an old network drive, not in a DAM system, and it's not searchable.
I have a question about that, actually. So say you do that and you get them all up there, is there a way to identify duplicate copies? So then you can get rid of a bunch of stuff that
There are a lot of services that do that. I haven't found it in OneDrive yet,
Okay.
but there are other softwares that will search, and they'll do it on network drives as well.
Oh, well, yes, but sometimes you've got a copy here, a copy there, a copy there. Like, every department has their own copy and nobody knows, well, is mine actually the same as yours or is it different?
Anybody have any recommendations for a tool for that? 'Cause
Yeah,
I always email it out and everybody says it's their personal drive, you know, it's.
Tree size is pretty good.
Dupe Guru is really good too.
But those are good for file servers, those aren't good for cloud.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we're moving to the cloud, so we want to get rid of it all on premise before, we want to get rid of duplication on premise before we go.
And maybe that's a conversation for file sharing and having shared drives instead of everybody having their own copy.
Yeah. Dupe Guru is really good for local files. And one thing that I do sometimes is upload things to SharePoint and then sync them locally and run Dupe Guru on them. So, pro tip. And I
Any
think
other-
it's Mac and PC, but I'm not totally sure.
Anything else on the too many files? I think the question of why are we keeping this came up in all of this, you know, and really drill into the root of, is it just, you know, ignorance, or is it, you know, just because we're museums, we keep everything, you know, what's, you know, why do we really?
Ultimately, it's cheap, it's cheaper.
It's cheap, totally.
Than to think about it.
Yep.
It's just cheaper to buy
Right.
extra drives.
Sure.
And hard to.
Yeah, it's not a pile of bankers' boxes sitting in the corner and somebody has to look at it every day and go, oh, we should do something about that.
Was there any conversation about how to get away from too many files?
Yeah.
Approaches, or, I mean, I've toyed with the idea of just taking all the network files and making them read-only, and then saying, if you wanna save something, you've gotta save it in a new platform. I don't know how much of a blowback that would cause.
A lot.
A lot.
Much.
Well, I do, but I wanna think about it, maybe that's what I would put it. But there seems like there's gotta be some process, not going to that extreme, but some way of handling that. I haven't wrapped my head fully around how to do that, but.
Yeah.
So the only one thing that we're talking about very, very loosely internally is that putting a cap on like department shares, right? You get 2 terabytes and after that, it's gonna cost you money to expand it, so it's forces them to clean or pay. It's not the greatest solution, but it's one way, it's strong arm.
Sure.
It's also possible there are a lot of firms that don't have good solutions, that this is the best solution, to just,
Right.
like you're saying, Google, put it all in one place, make it searchable, pay for the money to store it, and maybe that any other solution is too much overhead.
In the back?
Just as part of a production tutorial team, storage critters are begging of my existence. Mostly because I'm like, where do you think we work? We create constantly and collect constantly. Don't cap my story. Like figure out the infrastructure that works for my work.
Right, but if you plan accordingly, right, you can ask for the space ahead of time and say, we're gonna be creating this, and that allows your storage team to provision the right amount of storage, and you know, budget effectively as well.
Right.
So
And all those
there's-
things are things that museums don't do well.
And we don't fund IT well or collections well to actually extend. So it's hard to, you have to make sure you have, we talked about in too many files. Has anybody looked at where the chart of where they expect to be in storage use in 5, even 2 years with 4K and all that stuff?
That's a really good point, and it leads that conversation, because on my team, because I'm dealing with 4K, I've started planning, but my IT team are so swamped and under-resourced, they can't put together an infrastructure plan for me, so here am I, digging into storage.
So you're gonna go out and buy a couple terabyte hard drive and put it on your desk.
No.
And that's what you're gonna work off.
Don't do it.
What I've done.
Because that's what
Yeah.
you're
No.
So actually,
This
when
makes me
you-
work. My head is exploding. Have you ever seen Mars Attacks? Have you ever seen Mars Attacks? Where the aliens, their brains explode? That's me right now, yeah.
If you get some idea of what you're doing, and then you go to finance, and you say, we're a museum, we're an expensive, messy business, we have to do what we're doing, you gotta come up with another 10, 50, 100, $250,000 in the next couple of years, there's really no way around it. And then everybody's maybe not happy, but at least the problem is, we're an expensive business, but then finance needs to know that you're creating all this stuff, and it's important, that you have to convince them it's important, not just the IT guys.
I've definitely done that. I've gone to my executive management and tried to show the value of a house of cards in the burning building, that you have with your files. And this isn't even for our collection, this is just everything else. And they got it. They definitely got it. The look of fear in their eyes when we learned everything was palpable. I was like, yes! And then budget season came and I asked for an asset manager and they said, no. Because it's
It's money,
immediate,
yeah.
right? And it is hard to play a numbers game with something that is not, physical.
If you can tell them what you won't get then, great, I don't have this person, then we're not gonna do X, Y, Z.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to the next group so we don't run out of time, if that's okay. Records management? Is that where we are?
Yeah, we can keep going. That was us, we're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
Are you getting it? I think we've talked a lot about policy as well. Which seems like it's a big first step to start writing policy and identifying the types of files you have. We talked about whether you put the onus on each department to identify it, or if you look at things kind of more holistically. I was writing things down like, is this a working file, a preservation file, temporary, inactive, in progress? Some institutions really don't want to deal with the trying to manage working files, which is fair, and that's a headache. That's the thing I'm trying to deal with, the working file. And then what are the storage implications of those types of files? I brought up that I'm looking into a local cloud hybrid storage solution to save our IT team some costs with the amount that we pay for pulling things down from the cloud.
I heard and took away that having a records management policy seems it has an ROI to it. It can actually save all of us money by way of including what not to keep and what not to store, and giving reasons for not just keeping everything or not just storing everything. Let's see.
Yeah, it solves the too many files problem for you, basically, right?
I'm just gonna share some other quotes. Keeping everything and not knowing where it is, not being able to find it is essentially the same as not keeping it at all. Perhaps an idea for any of us is to write a grant to have a records manager come in for up to a year and create a policy for your organization or for our organizations. And I was trying to kind of pull out how do you start it, or tie it back to where do we start, where do I start? And one thought was you can start with your policy for anything new that gets created. We inherit all this history that policy-less pile of files
just kind of occurred in my institution, so I work at the 9/11 Museum, is because of the sensitivity of the raw material, there ends up being a point person in each department who all requests for content has to go through. It's not like it's not really official management, but because each department is kind of held accountable that if their content goes out into the world somewhere and it's not supposed to be there, all our president knows is like, that's the person who made it, why is that somewhere, even though it wasn't the person, like the content creator who distributed it. So because of that kind of fear, like things like communications or people who want to use that content end up contacting the content creator, and the content creator then, like for myself, I will set up an expired like website where I can make sure that wherever the streaming link is comes down, or wherever the file is, I like follow up and say, where did you put this file? Don't duplicate it. You know, always just come back to me if you need it in another version and things like that. So that's what they've done for the storage credits.
Did you guys talk about when it got to policy, who's writing that policy? Is it IT's job? Is it legal's job? Is it collections job? Because in my mind, it should be all three, but.
I have very strong feelings about this. Records management policy is not IT's job.
Right.
It's really not.
No,
it's just not. And
I don't think you're gonna hear me.
it's just really not. And, right? But unfortunately, it falls to us because we're the ones who are dealing with all this stuff, right? It's in our way. We have to get rid of it, right? But I mean, there are records managers in the world, and there are lots of resources out there. If you have a records manager on your staff, then they should be the one doing it, right? Obviously, many of us don't. If you have an archivist on staff, archivists and records managers are siblings, if not twins, so talk to them.
So if they're not writing the policies, are they enforcing the policies? Who's
They should be
enforcing
doing
them?
both. That
I mean,
that should be them.
What
And they should be doing it under consultation with legal people, like if you have a general counsel or whomever. I don't, different sized institutions have lots of different versions of these things. But at the very least, I want to second Sarah's comment about SAA. They have tons of resources online. There's a whole section of their website about records management, tons of examples of records management, or record schedules rather. They will set you in the right direction. If you find that you have to create a records management policy yourself, please go there first, don't just wing it. And it'll at least give you some ideas of how to start and what you're looking for and what you're trying to do.
Those policies apply to the marketing department, for instance. So that's
Yeah, it's everything, it's everything, yeah.
Okay.
I have a little different side on that one. I think it is the leadership of the organization.
Right.
I mean, with the records manager involved in it to guide as to what the best practices are. I don't think it's the task of the records manager as a whole to do the whole organization, because they wouldn't be in that overall overarching view, and they might not be able to implement or tell people to comply with
And that's the problem I have with our philanthropy department and our marketing
So
department.
I would
They don't-
recommend the leadership team with the records managers, and help to try to make sure that they're doing the right things.
Oh, I worked for a company one time that had, they had quotas and they had guidelines for, what should be stored on tape, at certain points. And, they would send out quarterly reminders, and then the company actually had a cleanup afternoon where nobody could work, but everybody had to just clean up their files and these
Try that, it
quotas.
doesn't work.
It would have it would actually be a physical and online, cleanup day where people cleaned up. And, because people need that. They need to be told they have to take the time to do it.
It definitely needs to be a directive from management that is important.
Our company, we have this thing once a year called Fall Haul, like in the fall, and people just go out and dump stuff. The sad thing is, actually, they used to give out gift cards for whoever dumped the most stuff, and I think physical stuff was stuff on the network, and then a month later, guess what? They're calling IT.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
But we do have quota, but we only have it on home user folders. And the only reason we have it on home users folders is because we know so that they
folders.
own all the way dies.
And keeping all their vacation pictures. All right.
I just want to add like the quota system, at least at MoMA, we have a lot of mission-driven content creation that gives you these enormous storage footprints. And I also just think like it's something that we're trying to kind of flip around, where if people become aware that what they're creating has a cost, that they're not just always having to react to having to build up that space, but that they can strategically think about it, because there's a lot tied into it, like about sustainability of file formats and like what the kind of shared thinking is about, like what is the master file for this video that's on Vimeo or YouTube now? What's its importance to the institution? How many years do they want it to be accessible? And so it kind of ties into these larger discussions. I feel like anybody who's like repeatedly hitting their quota, it's almost like a great list that we would like to have all in a room to help us make a policy around what's being created and where it belongs.
Okay, let's go on to the next group, just a value of time. Collaboration tools, file sharing.
How's us? So we stayed within our brief and didn't talk about governance and policy. No, it was a really good discussion. We kind of had a really good group of IT people and users. And some of the key things that came out from experience is a good pilot group for a new tool is incredibly valuable. That they're open to new ideas, so if they experiment and if they give you really good feedback, so you can make changes as you move to taking it across the organization. There are a lot of co-authoring limitations when you look at on-prem versus cloud, Office 365 online applications versus the desktop applications, and weighing staying in one environment versus spreading out. One person talked about how their boss wants them to save in multiple locations, and that is a fairly large red flag for me. It's also true.
Yes.
Combating the lack of literacy. This tool is going to save you time, but then also how much time it's going to take to train, especially in museum environment of people who are coming from typewriters and carbon copy and all that, and just data and digital is not in their wheelhouse. And then if a department is already using a tool really successfully, is to then take that tool, you know it works, it was maybe outside of IT, but it's a good tool, and then adopt it and take it across the organization. You already have a champion that says this works. And then as you go to users, there have been some IT departments that say, oh, here's this tool, use it. Like, well, what problem does it solve? How is it actually going to help us? Don't just build a tool for your users, talk to your users, find out what problems need to be solved, and then solve the problem instead of just, hey, we've got a sweet new tool and it does these awesome things. Talking on the file side, which we kind of talked a little bit about with too many files, of dead files, and who knows who's the owner of these files. And as you get file sharing, whether it's in one spot or 5 spots, and having permission controls, whether that's SharePoint or Google, to restrict editing, so it's just a view-only type of place where they can then take it down and edit it for themselves instead of people editing a template that everyone's supposed to have access to, and now everyone sees that department's budget because they're editing the main file. And then thinking about space, a lot of plans for business. Some are unlimited, some are so large for smaller organizations that you don't need to be concerned about space, but as we get into 4K and 8K, space balloons pretty quickly, and just planning ahead of time that your cloud location is going to grow with you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments from the other groups? awesome group.
I do have a question about the copies, right? I mean, what do you mean by that? Because sometimes what happens is you have to keep the active copy that is accessed by everybody, but you want to keep a safe copy for archives or whatever, no?
So from the IT side,
Rely, I mean, just being able to get it if something happens to this file.
so
That's called
from the
backup
IT
and
side,
restore.
that's when your backup comes in place. If you're using Office 365, you can use something like Beam. Yeah, and that also comes down to records management and
Well,
policies.
and retention, right? I mean,
Right.
So, what if it's 3 years and 1 day? Sorry.
That's based on your policy.
You guys are collaboration as well. The question I have that came up when we started talking about this is Office 365 a replacement for Dropbox? In terms of sharing large documents to outside vendors, like our publishing people, these giant files, I'm looking for more and more drivers to centralize on something
I
like
would say
Office
100%.
365.
Yeah.
And I was in that group, and we had one person who was using Box real successfully, and one person using Google Drive real successfully, and everybody else was very much Microsoft shop. So I think it doesn't matter which platform you use as much as just, centralizing on one and doing the education and everything else that we
For
talked
people who
about.
have been using Box or Dropbox and then moved to O365, they're able to drop their subscriptions to those, because O365 does everything you need.
Yes.
Yeah.
That gives me another
Yes.
checkbox,
Yeah.
to go up to my management.
Going back to what I mentioned earlier, is when we moved from Dropbox to Office 365, we used the cloud sync tool. So we let people operate in both environments, especially in the exhibits department. Why? Because they had the emails with the links to the Dropbox file, and they didn't have the links, so they started migrating and sending out the links to the Office 365 account, and doing that. So they were allowed to work in the duality until we pulled their rights to Dropbox, and it made that move a little bit easier, because they could figure out what the positives and negatives both were.
That was Cloud HQ.
Yeah, just Cloud HQ is what we used.
Janice, I have a question for you.
Uh-oh.
You said you're moving to E3. What was the business decision or technical decision moving to E3 license?
Mainly like we're on E1, and when you use E1 to collaborate in real time or co-author, there are some issues with it that because you're using Word Online at that point, and it was causing some people to like open a document and save a copy instead of working on the same doc, and sometimes not showing up as you're co-authoring. You don't see both
So
people.
basically having the office online.
Yeah, yeah. So that with E3, you download, you can download a local copy too, and it gives you more of those co-authoring and more features like that. And we do a lot of like advanced features in Word, so people will not be happy with just Word Online.
Did you go to E3 for everybody or just full-time staff?
We're in the process right now. We've only gone 5 people just to kind of test it out, but we will probably go most of our staff. We thought about like housekeeping and library volunteers and something like that. We thought about leaving them at E1, but they can't access online documents. So until we get all of our shared documentation like that to the cloud, they have to have E3 accounts and then maybe we can reevaluate it at that time and then lower the number. It's kind
Also, if you want to do anti-threat protection, you're going to need E3 or A3. But you might look into A3 too.
A3.
It's
Okay,
academic.
one more group.
process.
Okay, let's go ahead quickly with the last group.
Okay, governance and policies. So we went around and sort of talked about what our situations were. Many of us never had
Go ahead.
governance
We'll just look.
policies, or they are unevenly implemented, or there are standards in some areas but not in others. And we talked a little bit about why these problems arose, and often that's because of a lack of good communication between IT and the rest of the organization, people with different levels of understanding. We had a good conversation about needing to implement these policies at the point of hire, so onboarding and HR and getting those folks to understand and get on board. There were some horror stories of people emailing policies that were never read and, all this sort of thing. So understanding the importance and actually communicating that information accurately, you know, it's important to do from the very beginning. In many cases, there were problems with understanding roles and responsibilities. For example, with the issue of like the records manager develops the policy, but then they may not have the authority to enforce the policy. So making sure that the right people are at the table to make these decisions. Often there's a lack of understanding on the part of senior management and a sort of desire to just buy something to solve the problem rather than look deeply at the systemic issues. There's also a problem of over-talking these issues, that there can be many fragmented committees, you know, where many people discuss a lot of things, but nothing actually gets implemented because at the end of the day, the people who are creating those files are very busy with their various jobs, and so this learning process of changing behavior doesn't actually happen even if recommendations are made. There can be problems with people reporting to different leaders and upper management. So in one organization we talked about digital and IT were reporting to two different people. And so there's a need to have lateral conversations among the departments to make sure that basic functionalities actually work, which is challenging in that environment. And then we had a good conversation about talking about the policies that we do have in the IT SIG and how it might be helpful to have a set of recommendations of like what policies exist, what elements are there. I understand there's already a library, but it might be helpful to move it forward to actually identifying the main elements of a good set of policies. And then we talked a little bit about how to sort of understand where the pain points are and how to understand where it's a systemic issue rather than a symptom. And we had a great discussion about process improvement workshops and how that can be done.
Any input from the rest of the crowd? Awesome. Very good group.
Sure. I mean, thank you. Hopefully you got something out of this. You know, however long we've been together, 2+ hours, I guess, almost going on. So, those of you that took notes, if you could make sure to email it to Janice, is that
That's
okay?
fine, yeah, just email it to me.
Janice. Just email her a copy. She's got
I've
cards
got
up here.
cards
She
up
wanted to
here.
just take
Brand
a card.
new rebranded cards. So also, if you're not in the IT SIG.
Yeah,
it's-
I feel like we've just sort of scratched the surface here, and hopefully this conversation can continue. And I know Janice has done an excellent job as the chair of the SIG to try to, we try to do a monthly webinar of some type, knowledge share. In fact, we have a great recording of Abby's from a couple months ago that I would highly recommend you listen to from an archivist perspective, because I think it's super valuable. But maybe this could lead some of that conversation. So please engage with us in Basecamp or engage us through the SIG on Basecamp. And we have some time, so we'll stick around if there's anybody who wants to chat more. But thank you all so much. This went really well. If you have any feedback on this deep dive conversation session idea, please let us know. We'll make sure it gets back to the conference organizers, because I think they're looking to us to sort of provide some of that, since this was a little bit of an experiment, and see how this goes for future.
And make sure you do the review or the evaluation.
Oh, yeah, you can provide it through the review. Yeah,
the
you'll get
evaluation,
emailed a
but,
survey.
yeah.
But anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.